Right here, we got an alien. He's really rare. He's coming for you. Pew pew, pew pew, pew pew. Hey everybody, my name is Brendan Noble, and I'm a young adult author, and today we'll be continuing on our series of the top genres inside young adult fiction, and today we'll be talking about sci-fi. Sci-fi can be a really difficult genre to kind of pin down, especially in young adult, because it can be anything from dystopian to post-apocalyptic to space operas and the Star Wars style of things to anything with aliens. So it's a really wide spectrum of things, and it's kind of speculative fiction, and it can be kind of hard to just say that's science fiction or what's not, but we're kind of taking the broad view here and seeing everything under this kind of larger subheading. We're going to see what are the top niches we can talk about, what are some of the struggling ones, and then what are some of the top authors as well. So let's dive in. First, I would like to discuss the top 5 authors inside sci-fi and inside young adult fiction. First up, we have Brandon Sanderson. He's especially known for his adult books, but he's started especially writing in young adult more recently. He's been writing some dystopian books as well as some more hard sci-fi as well. So he's kind of got a more broad spectrum under this category. Numbers 2 and 3 are Neil Shusterman and Suzanne Collins, who are both dystopian authors, which is a large subgenre of sci-fi in the young adult category, which we'll be talking about later. Number 4 is Marissa Meyer, who writes more sci-fi action and adventure style, which kind of doesn't have a really specific subgenre, but kind of fits that more broad category as well. And number 5 is T.L. Payne, who writes post-apocalyptic fiction. Point number 2 is that sci-fi can be a really good selling point in young adult fiction, but it does not sell as well as fantasy. There's a lot less sci-fi books out there compared to fantasy books, first of all. There's only about 15,000 young adult sci-fi books on Amazon compared to over 35,000 fantasy books, which shows it's not as often as a written category. But 15,000 books is no small number, and it's still an incredibly competitive category. But again, with a lot of these smaller subgenres within it, it can be hard to say that some of these books are directly competing with each other. Still, overall, sci-fi inside young adult is ranked, the top 20 books overall are ranked 1600th on average on Amazon, which compared to fantasy is a very big difference. Fantasy was around 350 to 400th, which is a lot higher ranked, and it shows the popularity difference between fantasy and sci-fi. If you're a sci-fi author and that kind of has you concerned, I'd stick around for later in the video where we'll be talking about some of the specific subgenres and what are doing well and what aren't, because a lot is doing really well in sci-fi. It's just a lot more of a niche market compared to fantasy, which can have a very broad reach. Point number 3 is that book lengths in sci-fi can really vary. You can see some pretty short books around 300 to 350 with the more dystopian or post-apocalyptic books. And then you get into some of the space opera or a lot of hard sci-fi books. Those can get up to 450 to 500 pages as well. So there is still a very large range. And that just, again, reflects the variety of subgenres within sci-fi in general. So if you really want to write a long book, there's some subgenres within sci-fi that work for that. But if you want to look at a shorter book, it's not as low of a floor as fantasy is, but there's still some subgenres that can suit that. In point number 4, I'd like to talk about some of the hot subgenres within sci-fi that might not necessarily be the top sellers, but the ones that have the most potential for a new author to potentially break into. And first up, I'd like to talk about post-apocalyptic and apocalyptic books. There's only about 500 to 600 books in this category, which is surprising considering there's a lot of popularity there, but you'll see a lot of the focus has been on dystopian and less on post-apocalyptic, which has left a void, but there's a lot of readership here. And the average rank for the top 20 books within the post-apocalyptic category is about 6,000th overall in the store, which is very strong for a subgenre. And then again, for a book that only has about 500 books in it, that's a really solid ranking overall, and means it's a potential category where if you're looking for a genre to write in and you're interested in post-apocalyptic fiction, I would recommend getting into it because it's really hot right now. Another hot market that I don't have quite as many numbers on is steampunk. There's only about 1,000 books in this category, so it's still on the smaller side, but it's selling very well overall. And some of the top authors have even dipped their toes into this category, such as authors like Cassandra Clare. So there's a lot of potential here, and there's a very big niche market among steampunk readers that will pick up a lot of steampunk books and get into them. There's not as many books in the category, but with an avid readership, there could be a lot of potential for you to get into it and sell books. And the third hot market is time travel. This can fall under a lot of different subgenres that aren't only sci-fi, but they often do fall into the sci-fi category. There's only about 2,000 books inside this subgenre, and they're ranked about 15,000th overall, which again is not as strong as the post-apocalyptic number, but still strong for a subgenre, and it has a lot of potential. If you're scared to write some of the longer books in sci-fi, this could be also a category for you, since time travel books only tend to be about 300 to 350 pages compared to some of the longer books in hard sci-fi. And fifth, I'd like to talk about niches that are struggling either because there's a lot of books in it, or that they're just struggling to sell even with a smaller number of books. Now, this first one might be a controversial opinion, especially coming from an author in this genre, but I'm gonna have to say dystopian would be a struggling one, because there's about 5,000 books within the dystopian subgenre, and that's 1/3 of the sci-fi market in general. Even though the average ranking is very high for this category, with the top 20 books ranking about 2,000th overall in the Amazon store, there's so many books in the wake of the Hunger Games that have been written that have been kind of swamped this market and made it struggling to sell. Can be possibilities to sell well within dystopian, but it's incredibly competitive and it's not the best market to get into if you're looking to sell. Compared that to post-apocalyptic, and there seems to be a lot more potential there with a lot less competition. And second, I'd like to talk about space opera, which is kind of like your really hard sci-fi, something you'd imagine more as kind of the Star Trek or Star Wars or something like that vibe, where there's the big intergalactic conflict that's there's a lot of drama between the different countries or intergalactic nations. There's only about 300 young adult books within the space opera genre because there's a lot of work that has to go into these books. Kind of like we talked about in epic fantasy in the last video, these books are around 450 to 500 pages sometimes because there's a lot of world building that needs to go into it, because often you're building more than one world. But unlike epic fantasy, this genre is not selling that well. The average ranking of the top 20 books within the space opera genre in young adult is ranked around 50,000th, which is not very highly ranked. Even though there's only 300 books in the category, you would expect a little bit of a higher rank by now if you wanted to find some potential for more readership. So it's a really niche market there, and because it's a lot of effort to put into, it can be a hard market to start writing in. And that's all I have for you today on the sci-fi market inside of young adult. Again, sci-fi has a lot of potential niches within it, but some of them are very competitive, but others have a lot of potential. But even as sci-fi doesn't sell as well as fantasy overall, because of the niche elements of this market, they can find a lot of avid readers within it and gain a lot of loyal following within some of them, such as authors like Brandon Sanderson have gained. So I would not deviate from sci-fi if it's something that you're really passionate about writing. If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe down below. Next week, I'll be talking about the third largest genre with young adult fiction, and that's romance. On a personal note, I know I just went around trashing the dystopian genre for being too competitive, but my third book, Pridefall, in the PRISM File series comes out tomorrow on this Saturday. So, if you want to go and grab your copy, you can pre-order it now on Amazon to have it ready for you tomorrow morning. Where you going, buddy? He likes to go up.